So, in part one of our study, we've studied how the Bible writers assumed that Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 were literal history. And we saw that Moses saw it as being literal in Exodus chapter 20, that Jesus saw it as being literal in Matthew chapter 19, and that Paul saw it as being literal in Romans chapter 5. All three of these people inspired by the Holy Spirit. And so we can deduce from that it is true that Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 are history and not a fable. And so what I want us to do in the second part is to study the differences in chapters 1 and chapters 2 and see why those differences exist. Now, the book of Genesis gives us the best origin story, if you will, of all the cultures that existed during the day. The Babylonians had this idea that the world, the creation, was the result of two gods that had fought, and one god had been split in half, and the world had been created within that decaying body. The Egyptians had this idea that an ibis had laid an egg, and within that, the gods were created and mankind as well. And yet, as you and I study and look around us, we see Romans chapter 1 and verse 20 tells us that this world that's created shows us the invisible attributes of God so that we're without excuse. Genesis chapter 19 and verse 1 tells us the earth and the firmament show us the handiwork of God and remind us of his great power, of who he truly is. And so let's look at chapters 1 and 2. Now, sometimes in different commentaries or from different scholars or preachers, you'll hear that Genesis 1 and 2 are myth. Now, scholastically, academically, that's true because Jack Lewis used to tell us, Dr. Jack Lewis from Harding graduate, he's passed on to his reward already, used to tell us that any interaction between gods and man is called mythology. And so the word myth doesn't mean technically true or false. It just talks about the interaction between God and man. And from that definition, yes, Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 are myth. And yet, when people use the word myth today, they're usually speaking more of this word fable. In other words, a made-up story which somebody has come up with to talk about why the world looks the way that it does. Well, Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 look very different. Genesis chapter 1, you'll notice the poetry and the structure of the book. It's a very poetic way of putting it. In day 1, God created light. Day 2, God created the skies. Day 3, God created the land and the sea. Now, day 4, we take day 1 and we fill it up. On day 1, he made light. And day 4, we fill that light or that sky up with the sun and the moon and the stars. Day 5, we take that sky and that sea and we fill it up with the birds and the fish. Day 6, we take that land and we fill it up with the animals and with mankind. And so you'll notice it's very structured. Now, when you come to chapter 2, there's no more poetry. It's very much of a narrative story. And when you begin reading in chapter 2, you see the movement which is there. God creates Adam. He makes the garden. He makes the animals appear so that they can be named. And when there's nobody who's shown to be a companion, a true companion to Adam, then Eve is created. So what about these differences between chapters 1 and chapter 2? In Genesis 1, the word for God in Hebrew is Elohim, which means the overall powerful God, the God of all nations, whether they believe or not. Genesis chapter 2 is the word Yahweh, and usually we think of that as a personal God who has a personal relationship with his people. Well, the early church fathers would read through this. One person would be Origen. He came 3rd century about, and a lot of his writings are pretty interesting, but he read Genesis 1 and 2, and he saw it even back then as symbolic and not as literal. Augustine of Hippo, he was a church father, a scholar from North Africa. That's a city, Hippo, in North Africa. And he saw it as literal, but he said it was given to those people at that time, and as we learn more about science, we learn more about the world, then we'll have a different understanding. Thomas Aquinas, John Wesley Aquinas from the 13th century were similar. That they would say, well, is sort of literal, but it's written to the people's understanding back at that time of how creation would have gone. Well, the question is, for us in our modern day mindset, our scientific and the scientific theory mindset that we have, can we take Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 as literal teaching? Well, I believe we can. And that's because the structure of the book of Genesis. If you'll notice, 10 times, really 12, but as far as the structure of Genesis, 10 times the word generation is used, toledot. And Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 verse 4, you see this toledot. You see this where it begins to show the nation of Israel who they are when they're in the wilderness. Who are you? Who is this God? And how have we become the people we've become is what the answer is to the Jews. And so when you look at that, you see that that is the case. As you continue looking, you see Genesis chapter 2 can really be understood as the actions which happen on the sixth day. You see, God created Adam on the sixth day. The plants begin to appear. God, even though the world was created, He is forming a garden. He is forming the plants in that garden to be right where He wants them to be in the nature in which they are. The animals, they've been created in Genesis chapter 1, but God brings the animals to Adam into this garden to show mankind's authority over creation as He names them. In the Bible, giving someone a name shows their authority over them. God creates Eve from the side of Adam, from his rib, or from his side, literally. And this happens on the sixth day, and it shows the relationship that man and woman have together. And so all these things work together. Now, do they contradict? No, but they're shown from a different perspective. Genesis chapter 1 is the perspective of the Elohim, the God who does all things. Genesis 2 shows the relationship that God has with Adam and Eve and how they're special. He's created a special place, a special home for them to be.